to episode 3 of the Lone Hockey Podcast. Really exciting episode today, building off the on puck play that we discussed yesterday and also off puck play we just discussed the day before. Today, we're going to be discussing lessons from scouting. So, I scouted a few years for the Chicago Steel of the USHL, and I wanted to provide some lessons that I've learned from scouting thus far and how important it's been for me to analyze certain trends within the game, analyze and incorporate analytics into my evaluations. We're going to go over some players that I've evaluated in terms of consistency that were really, really effective for the years I scouted. And we're going to go over some other stuff as well. And so, one of my first lessons, and one of the first things I learned from scouting was really understanding how to evaluate players on an in-depth basis. Now, when it comes to evaluating players, it's so easy to provide vague terminologies and players, but how do you evaluate the game more in depth? How do you evaluate the game in nuanced ways that no one else is going to look at? And that's the biggest question because, yes, it's so easy to say, oh, this player has good skating, good puck skills, he can shoot the puck. What does that actually mean? So there's technical skills that go into each of these components. It's not just, oh, he can shoot the puck. He or she can shoot the puck really well. It's more a matter of understanding the details within those patterns and understanding the details within the player themselves. So a lot of shot fundamentals, it could be lower body and understanding the lower body weight transfer. It could be understanding how they position their feet. It could be understanding how they position their feet coming off the rush or coming down the wall or coming through the dot lane and looking to create a shot through that as well. Or it could be stride extension. Do they use a full range of stride extension on their shots, or do they just use a half stride extension? And for example, with puck skills, it could be understanding space. It could be understanding how to lead guys into space when you have the puck on your pass is very translatable skill, for example. And there's so many other components. These are just a few examples. So many other components that are really valuable when talking about the depth of scouting. It's really, really important to understand the game more in depth and to evaluate the game more in depth to get that broader perspective, that very nuanced perspective in order to evaluate players on a really consistent basis over time. And this is what separates a lot of great scouts from maybe some average scouts. And another thing is what really makes a player with great hockey sense? It's a big question. It's what is hockey sense? What is hockey sense? What is this? What is that? And when it comes to hockey sense, it's really unique because hockey sense isn't just something where it's just smarts. It's really diving deep into a player to understand how they process situational patterns, how they process situations off the rush and inside the offensive zone, how they move off the puck, how they move into space, how they stay between their checks. And I think of a player, for example, who was a really good scouting example when I would watch him on video, just as an NHL player example, Patrice Bergeron and the positional discipline that he had, not only with his route timing, but also being able to position himself in really good situations above the puck, staying in position, being able to be a support option all the time while not sacrificing too much. So he's able to provide a lot of space for himself and he was able to put himself in really good space because his positional discipline was so above everybody else. It made him such a fascinating player, not only in D zone situations, but O zone as well, and coming off the rush. And he was such a threat. He was such a good player throughout the 2010s. And he was so consistent in terms of his defensive habits. One of the most consistent players I've evaluated on video from the NHL by far. And in terms of his defensive habits, it's really hard to find a player that comes close, at least in the modern day era. Obviously, he's not playing anymore, but a really good example with that as well. And so the other thing that's really interesting, and another one of my lessons I've learned when it comes to scouting players is the transition they make. So scouting with the Steel, scouting with a junior age team, U20 team, you obviously have phase one and phase two of the draft. Phase one is a very select group of futures players. It's a select age group. It's only one age group. So this coming season, it's going to be 2009s. This past year was 2008s. And phase two is any player eligible for junior hockey. So any player that is under 20 and is within that birth range and birth year range they're able to get drafted in phase two. And phase two is a very long process, and usually it takes a while for teams to make their picks. They usually go for some value picks early, and then sometimes they'll look to round out their group as well. And phase one, a lot of emphasis is on getting the most value out of the picks, especially early with a lot of the NTDP kids. And depending on if they make the NTDP or not, kids that don't make the NTDP usually go very high. And so, going off my example though, when it comes to evaluating players, especially from U14 to U15, some players struggle coming out of major, Bantam major to their first season midget. And this is a variety of different factors. It could be scheduling, it could be practices, it could be understanding their body more. Because some players, they're still trying to go through the puberty process at that age. So it can depend really where their body is at. Some players they're late bloomers, some players are early bloomers. It really depends on where their genetics are at and where it's allowing them to move forward as well. And some players they also benefit from moving from U15 to U16. So this could depend on if they're staying with the same team consistently, if they like the team, if they're doing really well with the team that U15 year. Obviously, they're more likely to stay that U16 year, especially in past seasons if they were with many different programs and different programs that didn't quite work out for them. If they have a U15 season where they play really well, they're able to feed off that heading into the U16 season. So it's good for some players. Whereas obviously some going from U14 to U15, it really depends and can be really interesting to study how some of those players do either get better or they taper off a little bit. But from U15 to U16, U16 is really interesting because U16 is when they get closer to junior hockey, and usually players after they get drafted, especially in the USHL draft process, usually it's U16, especially if you're a higher draft pick, U16, then you play in the USHL. It's not quite as easy for those draft picks moving down the list and moving down the rounds to make it right away, but over time, there's some players who the average age is around 17 or 18 to be able to make it to USHL from that draft process. So coming out of U16, U16 is a really important year because it could really distinguish the player from moving up to U18. Sometimes U18 is a good thing, but when you're playing U15, U16, U18, multiple years of midget, and you might get that extra year of U18 as well in recent years, then it could be you could stagnate. The player could stagnate his or her development. So it could really depend on that. It's really, really interesting to study how players go from U16 to U18 as well, because some players, again, they do really well, other players don't. But when they get to their first year junior or wherever they go coming out of U18, because typically when a player comes out of U18, they're going junior. It happens a lot and it's really likely. And it could depend on the league, whether they're playing a tier one, tier two, tier three team, especially in the US. And Canada could get a little bit more complicated up there, but especially in the US, it could really depend. So, in a really good player example, one of my favorite examples in terms of the players I have evaluated over the years and how consistent this player was James Hagens. And James Hagens is projected first overall pick in the 2025 NHL draft. He's going to go to Boston College next year with his brother Michael Hagens coming off his season with the Steel and 2 years with the Steel. And James Hagens is a really dynamic player. James Hagens is going to light it up for sure next year in college hockey. He's so good. He's so smart. He plays like a Jack Hughes, and he's one of the most consistent players I've evaluated in my reports in every level that I've evaluated him. And I believe I evaluated him going back to late U13 and consistently around his U14 year for sure with Mount. I didn't evaluate him a ton. I would watch some video on him because I was just fascinated by the player. And he was still so good then too. And obviously he was lighting it up. And James Hagens, like I said, he's like a Jack Hughes. He plays very modern day in terms of his puck skills, in terms of his offensive IQ and his in zone IQ. He's able to control the puck like he's on a string. So he's able to use hip pocket deception. He's able to understand how to use his backhand. He can use backhand toe drags. He can handle pucks from really uncomfortable areas within his body. And that's a really rare trait to have. Obviously, projected first overall pick, which makes it, I guess you could say, less intriguing and less surprising, but just the skill and the highlight reel plays he's able to make, that's what makes him the most surprising. You never really know what you're going to get out of him sometimes because he's so unpredictable, but in a good way, especially offensively. And that's a bad thing for defenders. But by far one of the most consistent players. Going back to his Mount St. Charles days, he was so dynamic. He was tearing it up. I remember he had some games at Nationals because they would go to Nationals pretty much with him as the driver there in the offensive boat. He would just light it up. He would light guys up around the crease, inside dangerous areas. So he was attacking interior almost all the time. His mind was set on attacking interior. I want to get this puck. I want to go to the middle. It's not, oh, I want to handle this puck. Sometimes he might get forced outside, but most of the time he's finding middle. Most of the time, with that skill alone, he was going to find the middle of the ice. And another really good example is a recent draft pick, recent first overall pick of the San Jose Sharks, Macklin Celebrini. Yes, Macklin Celebrini, such a fascinating player too. Obviously, he was the first overall pick, so he deserved the right to be in that spot for sure. And with Macklin, going back to his days when he was playing with Shattuck, because he had a big jump playing U14 Shattuck to U18 Shattuck. That's a big jump for any player. It doesn't really matter if you're a lead or not. But for him, obviously, it's seamless given his advanced skill set. He was playing up for so long, and he's been playing at such a high level for so long that he's just gotten used to playing up. So it doesn't really phase him, obviously, and obviously he's able to adapt much easier. But with Shattuck, he was so consistent, somewhat similar to the Bergeron example when I was talking about earlier with the defensive habits and how his positional discipline was very mature for his age. I remember watching him before he came to the Steel, and I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, this kid's going to be better than Adam Fantilli was when Adam Fantilli was with the Steel, obviously now with the Columbus Blue Jackets. But I was watching him. I was really fascinated by his development because he plays a very mature game. It's you know what you're going to get from him, and you know what you're going to get from his habits. And very, very, very rare to find a player that has and brings those, both of those. So with Macklin, he was really intriguing in that sense and how he's able to be so consistent to the point where you're like, yeah, you knew this player was going to light it up his first year in the USHL. He was just so good. With Shattuck, when you evaluated him consistently, you'd see the trends in his game. It's you're not really seeing much, but that's a good thing. And what I mean by you're not seeing much is you're not seeing much change from him game to game. You're seeing a lot of that consistency at a high level, which is really good. And another interesting example was Zeev Buium. And Zeev Buium was I forget what spot he was picked in, but he was drafted by the Minnesota Wild. It was past 10. I remember that. I don't remember which spot. It might have been 12. And Zeev Buium, even though he slipped in the draft, he's going to be a really good player in the future. He's developed, and his developmental trajectory the last few years has been unbelievable. Coming from Shattuck to the NTDP to playing with Denver now, it's just been fascinating because he's a player who I remember watching him when he was with Shattuck and see some showcases when he was playing in Chicago and some games in general. And Zeev was a guy who he obviously stood out, but you didn't necessarily see a ton of. I believe he was playing U15 at that time. I remember that, and so he was playing U15, and he was really interesting because he was a really good skater. You could see the skating flair, you could see some puck skills, but you didn't see a ton of him being so involved like he is with Denver in this past season, not only with the World Junior team with USA and with Denver, he's just so dynamic offensively. He's so dynamic in how he's attacking downhill in the ozone, so dynamic in how he's walking the line, so dynamic in how he's pursuing pucks and getting first touch, getting first contact. Like a lot of play driving elements in his game in all three zones that he showed some frequency in when he was with Shattuck, but he didn't show a ton of it. So he really built and layered upon that from his time at the NTDP as well. And it's really interesting to see how he trended his game at the NTDP, continued to get better there, continued to get better in a really, really strong way playing his first season with Denver. He could be a player that could very well be NHL ready in the next 1.5 years. So he's a really fascinating player. And so going off these few examples, scouting just creates a general discussion at a very in-depth basis for so many different players. And the more depth you scout a player and you're really able to understand the fundamentals that go into the player, you're able to understand what makes a player tick. You're able to understand the consistency or inconsistency within a player's game. You're able to understand how the player trends from game to game and how they trend throughout the season. So how they develop from U14, U15, U16, beyond that point, how they develop within those seasons specifically as well. Very intriguing. So the more depth you're able to scout a player in and the more viewings you're able to have on a player, you get a really much better feel for the player themselves. And another thing is analytics, and this is another big lesson I've taken away in scouting so far is analytics are leveraged, but they're not the full story. So analytics, you have to have some eye tests, some analytical elements. You've heard a lot about those primary things, analytics and eye tests, but with analytics, they're a very good support option. So if you're watching and evaluating a player, you're able to get a better feel for what the player is, especially if the player is inconsistent in some ways. If you look at the analytics and you look at the raw data, you're able to understand some of the inconsistencies potentially and some of the potential consistencies with the player as well. So it can create broader discussion. It can create a more well-rounded discussion. It's very important to at least utilize the tool if they're available. And obviously at the lower levels compared to the pro, there's not much feasibility when it comes to analytics for youth players because there's so many youth players around so many different teams, so many different regions, so many different states, so many different nations, so many different countries, every which way. There's so many youth players everywhere. And analytics are very important. And this is why Instat was so beneficial. Instat was tracking everything. Instat was able to track everything and be able to provide information that not many other service providers could. And I think of one player who was really dynamic with the eye test, really dynamic with his analytics and his zone entries, his neutral zone rushes, and some inconsistency with D zone stuff, but he's going to get better with it as he ages. LJ Mooney, 2025 draft eligible prospect playing with the National Team Development Program right now. Heading into his U18 season, he's gotten some time already playing up with the U18 team this past season. Very dynamic player, but the thing that really stands out to me the most with him, you obviously see the skating, but it's not even that. It's the competitive drive that he has and the will to win that he has is unmatched. And you could tell when he plays on the ice, he wants the puck, he wants to go after it every single time he's on the ice. He does it relentlessly, and he's not afraid of everybody. He's only, I believe, around 5'7", 5'8", but he plays such a tenacious game. He's like a smaller version, in a sense, of Logan Cooley, and Logan Cooley obviously played with the National Team Development Program, playing with Utah Hockey Club. And there's some similarities. Obviously, again, Mooney's a little smaller, but I see a lot of similarities in their puck skills, their offensive acumen, and how they process the game with the puck on their stick. So, and linking together their on puck play inside offensive zone situations. And obviously, ironically, Mooney is a cousin of Logan Cooley as well. So there's some relatability there. And they played their youth hockey with Pittsburgh Penguins elite AAA program. So LJ Mooney was a player that stood out with the raw data every time I watched him and all the viewings and all the games. I would check some of his reports and stuff and some of the game reports. And he was such a fascinating player to evaluate analytically because obviously you see sometimes the natural shots and the shot attempts that he'd have, but you'd see other in-depth data, and he was so effective even at that smaller stature. So a lot of different elements that are very intriguing when it comes to Mooney's game heading into the future.